On the afternoon of March 13, 1951, a television camera in a Manhattan courtroom pointed down at a pair of hands. Not a face, hands. They rested on a table, fingers laced, then unlaced, then tapped once against the wood. Millions of Americans were watching those hands on live television, because the man they belonged to had refused to let the camera show anything else. His name was Frank Costello. For 20 years, federal investigators, New York City police, and half of Tammany Hall's political machine had called him the most powerful man in organized crime in America. The newspapers had a different name for him. They called him the Prime Minister of the Underworld. On that afternoon, the country finally got to watch him, or at least, watch what he allowed them to see. By 1951, Frank Costello had spent nearly 3 decades building something almost none of his peers ever managed. Influence without the electric chair, power without a body count attached to his own name, and a public reputation as a fixer, a diplomat, a man who could get a judge appointed or a slot machine license approved with a phone call. He did not build his reputation on violence. He built it on access. And in the spring of 1951, that access was about to be dragged, hand by hand, into the brightest spotlight organized crime in America had ever faced. Francesco Castiglia was born on January 26, 1891, in the small town of Lauropoli, in the Calabria region of southern Italy. His family emigrated to New York City when he was a small child, settling in East Harlem, a neighborhood crowded with immigrant families building lives from almost nothing. By his teenage years, he had taken the name Frank Costello, a practical choice, common among the era's young Italian immigrants, trying to move more easily through an English-speaking city. His first arrests came young: gun possession, gang activity, the ordinary entry points into New York's street-level criminal economy. According to Anthony DeStefano's biographical work on the era's bosses, Costello served roughly 10 months in prison in his early 20s on a weapons charge, a formative stretch that, by his own later account to associates, convinced him that guns were a liability rather than an asset for a man who intended to survive in this business. That decision, to build power through connections rather than through the muzzle of a gun, became the defining feature of Costello's career. During Prohibition, Costello partnered with a rising circle of young, ambitious criminals who would come to define organized crime in America for the next 50 years. Charles Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Vito Genovese, and later Bugsy Siegel. Costello ran bootlegging operations that moved liquor through the New York waterfront and beyond, but his specific talent, the one that separated him from his partners, was political. He built relationships with judges, city officials, and Tammany Hall power brokers, greasing the machinery that let the rest of the operation function without constant police interference. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, Costello had shifted his primary business into something that would define the rest of his career: illegal gambling, run at a scale, and with a level of political protection that few other operators in the country could match. When Lucky Luciano was convicted in 1936 on prostitution-related racketeering charges, a prosecution led by Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey, Luciano went to prison, and control of the organization he had built passed, day to day, into Costello's hands. Luciano was later paroled in 1946 on the condition that he be deported to Italy, and from exile, he continued to hold nominal authority over the family. But it was Costello who ran daily operations in New York. It was Costello who met with politicians. It was Costello whose phone calls decided which judges heard which cases, and which slot machine operators kept their routes. According to Raab's 5 families, it was during this period, the late 1930s through the late 1940s, that the press coined the nickname that would follow Costello for the rest of his life: the Prime Minister of the Underworld. Not a boss who ruled by fear inside his own organization, but a fixer who governed by favor, obligation, and relationship, the way a political operator governs a legislature rather than an army. The scale of Costello's gambling operation extended well beyond New York. He partnered with Louisiana Governor Huey Long in the 1930s to place slot machines throughout New Orleans and the surrounding parishes, an arrangement that generated enormous revenue and demonstrated Costello's specific gift: the ability to make illegal enterprise look, to state and local authorities, like a manageable, even mutually beneficial, business relationship. He was rarely charged with violent crime, because he was rarely, if ever, present for it. His name appeared in police files, not next to accounts of murder, but next to accounts of dinners, favors, and appointments. That reputation, untouchable, well-connected, more diplomat than gangster, could not survive what came next. In 1950, the United States Senate established the Special Committee to investigate organized crime in interstate commerce, chaired by Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee. The Kefauver Committee held hearings in cities across the country, and by early 1951, its investigation had reached New York, where Frank Costello was called to testify. The hearings were broadcast on live television, one of the first major televised congressional investigations in American history, and an estimated 30 million Americans tuned in over the course of the proceedings. Costello's lawyers negotiated a condition before his appearance. The cameras would not show his face. What resulted was the moment that defined his public legacy more than any other single event in his life. According to the published Kefauver Committee transcripts, Costello grew increasingly agitated under questioning about his relationship with Tammany Hall officials and the source of his wealth. Partway through the hearings, he walked out, refusing to continue testifying. That walkout resulted in a federal contempt of Congress conviction in 1952. The hands-only broadcast, meanwhile, had already done its damage. It stripped away the image Costello had spent 2 decades constructing. The public no longer saw a shadowy fixer operating at a comfortable distance. They saw a nervous man's hands, visibly uncomfortable, unable to answer simple questions about where his money came from. The federal government did not stop at contempt of Congress. In 1954, Costello was convicted on federal tax evasion charges, a prosecutorial strategy federal investigators had used successfully against organized crime figures going back to Al Capone 2 decades earlier. When direct evidence of racketeering was difficult to secure, the government built its case around unreported income instead. Costello was sentenced to prison and served time before his conviction and subsequent release. But the federal government's most aggressive move against him came next, an attempt to strip him of his United States citizenship entirely. Federal prosecutors argued that Costello had concealed his criminal history at the time of his naturalization decades earlier and moved to denaturalize him, a legal proceeding that, if successful, would have made him eligible for deportation, the same fate that had already befallen Luciano. The case worked its way through the federal court system for years, and ultimately reached the Supreme Court of the United States. In 1961, the court ruled in Costello v. United States, finding in Costello's favor and preserving his citizenship. According to Raab's account in 5 Families, the ruling was among the more significant legal setbacks the federal government experienced in its broader campaign against organized crime leadership during this period, a reminder that even a documented life of criminal enterprise did not automatically strip a naturalized citizen of constitutional protection. By the mid-1950s, Costello's public exposure through the Kefauver hearings had weakened his standing within his own organization. His reputation as a fixer who worked in the shadows had been replaced, in the public record, with hours of televised testimony. Inside the family, tension had been building for years between Costello and Vito Genovese, another founding partner of the organization from the Luciano era, who had returned to the United States after years in Italy, years spent partly evading a New York murder charge, and who had never accepted Costello's continued leadership of an organization Genovese believed should have passed to him. According to both Raab and De Stefano's separate accounts, Genovese viewed Costello's high public profile and the federal scrutiny it attracted as a direct threat to the organization's survival, and Genovese began quietly building support among capos and soldiers to move against him. That conflict reached its breaking point on the evening of May 2, 1957. Costello was returning to his apartment building at 115 Central Park West in Manhattan when a gunman approached him in the lobby. According to court records and Raab's documented account, the gunman said a short phrase, "This is for you, Frank," before firing a single shot at close range. The bullet grazed Costello's scalp. He survived, bleeding but conscious, and was taken to Roosevelt Hospital. Investigators later identified the shooter as Vincent Gigante, at the time a rising soldier in the organization who would, decades later, come to run the family himself, under a very different reputation for evasion, feigning mental illness for years to avoid prosecution. Costello, in keeping with the code of silence that governed his world, told police he had not gotten a clear look at his attacker and declined to identify anyone. Gigante was later charged in connection with the shooting and acquitted at trial, in part because Costello's own testimony offered nothing to support the prosecution's case. But inside the organization, the message had already been delivered and understood. According to De Stefano's account, a note was found in Costello's coat pocket after the shooting, listing gambling win figures from a Las Vegas casino operation, a detail investigators later connected to a broader skimming operation under investigation by federal authorities, and one that added to the case federal prosecutors were building against organized crime figures with interests in Nevada gaming throughout the later 1950s. Costello understood the arithmetic of what had happened to him. He had survived an assassination attempt, ordered, virtually every historian of the period agrees, on Vito Genovese's authority. He could fight to hold his position and risk a second attempt succeeding, or he could step back. He chose to step back. In the months that followed, Costello effectively ceded day-to-day control of the organization to Genovese, retreating into a quieter role. Still respected, still consulted, but no longer the man whose word ran the operation. The organization that Costello had guided since Luciano's imprisonment 2 decades earlier would, from this point forward, be known to federal investigators and historians alike as the Genovese family, a name it carries in the documented record to this day. Costello lived the remaining 16 years of his life largely outside active organized crime leadership. He remained a figure of interest to federal investigators, and his name continued to surface in hearings and reports throughout the 1960s, but the day-to-day authority that had defined his career belonged, by then, to Genovese and the men around him. According to recognized organized crime historians, Costello spent much of this later period at his Central Park West apartment and at a country home in Sands Point, on Long Island, largely withdrawn from the operational world he had once run. It bears stating plainly, as it must in every account of this era, the men of organized crime, Costello among them, represented a small criminal minority within the Italian-American community of their time. The overwhelming majority of Italian immigrants and their children, who built lives in New York and across the United States in this period, had no connection to organized crime whatsoever. They worked in factories, on docks, in small businesses, in schools, and in the armed forces during 2 world wars. The documented record of men like Costello is a record of specific individuals and specific criminal conduct, not a reflection on the broader Italian-American community, which built much of the 20th century American city these men operated inside of, and which bore no responsibility for their crimes. Frank Costello died on February 18, 1973, of a heart attack at his Manhattan apartment. He was 82 years old. According to Raab's account, he died a free man, never deported, never stripped of citizenship, and never convicted of the kind of violent racketeering charge that had ended so many of his peers' lives in prison or worse. Historians who have studied the period consistently place him in a distinct category among the era's organized crime bosses, not the most feared, not the most violent, but arguably the most politically effective. A man whose primary weapon across 4 decades in the business was not a gun, but a phone call, a favor, and a relationship carefully maintained. The documented history of Frank Costello is, in the end, a case study in a different kind of criminal power than the one usually associated with organized crime in the popular imagination, the kind built not on fear inside an organization, but on influence outside of it. It is also, ultimately, a story about what happens when that kind of power runs into a spotlight it cannot control. The hands on that television screen in March of 1951 told the country something the newspapers had been saying about Frank Costello for 20 years already. They just made 30 million people watch it happen in real time. Organized crime built its empire in the dark. Federal prosecutors and historians spent decades dragging it into the light. The 5 family files exists to document what they found, not to glorify it, not to bury it, but to remember it. Good night from the archive.